Hi, and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode without a number because it's a bonus episode. Because Ikoria is coming to Arena after a long break from having it. Ikoria being my favorite format, so I decided to make a bonus episode and talk about my thoughts about the format, built on my experience of playing it gazillion times, enjoying it every single time, and I think being the best format of all times for me, for reasons I'm trying to maybe lay out to convince you. And of course, thanks to my patrons and thanks to mtgazone.com, I actually wrote down this and it should appear in a written form tomorrow on mtgazone as an article, so you can read it before you start jamming those Ikoria drafts if you don't have enough time to watch this seminar. But obviously, seminars are always slightly deeper. Um, I'm not I'm not limited by the number of words I can type in a couple of hours in those seminars, so that's much better in that way. Okay, there is a preamble, as always. Ikoria is my favorite set of all times in terms of draft, but it's my thing. I don't need you to think like me, and in fact, I think the world might be a better place with fewer copies of me. It's good that we have some diversity. It's good that some people have different opinions, and it's good that people enjoy different things. And especially in Magic, I always found it very petty that people feel like other people need to like what they like. I don't have that need. I enjoy Ikoria, and not much is going to change that. If someone doesn't enjoy Ikoria, I found it peculiar, but then I will try to figure out why they don't like it, and maybe they prefer sets that are heavy on the gameplay. And Ikoria is actually probably one of the heaviest sets in terms of how you draft your deck, and how you draft your deck is going to determine quite a lot, because I think it's potentially one of the most synergistic sets of all times, and that's why I like it, because that's what I like in draft. I like synergy, and I don't like power, and I don't like I don't like raw power, and I don't like formats that force you to sort of build this incremental game where you do right decision, plan long term, and accrue those small kind of edges here and there, and that's how you win the games. I was just talking about it with Jean-Emmanuel Deprat through the means of his Twitch chat, and he loves Theros Beyond Death. I actually hated that format, and potentially one of the reasons why I didn't like it was because that was exactly that kind of a format. You draft a deck, the power level is going to be relatively flat between the decks, and then it starts to become a game of who makes fewer mistakes. And I rarely will win those games. I know that. I know my weaknesses, and one of my weaknesses is I am not the tightest of players, and I could improve on those. However, I'm really good at visualizing the draft, visualizing synergies, building a deck, making sure that everything on the deck building part is fine. And then I have to build the deck very well, because I know that I will be leaking value through my bad plays. And because of that, Ikoria is a format that heavily favors me. That's probably why I like it. But it also favors what I like doing while I'm drafting, building decks and finding quirky build arounds that maybe will happen once every 100 times. And Ikoria is a draft of format of 50 different archetypes that you can build. And because of that, those once in 100 times archetypes come together pretty frequently. And that always makes me feel great about the format, because sometimes you will just draft cycling deck, which is pretty straightforward. But sometimes you will draft like a Mardu Aristocrats kind of style. Sometimes you will play Mutate Pile. Sometimes you will add some kind of reanimation to it. Sometimes you will draft a Why Not a deck. And there's so many other options in there. So yeah, that's why I do like it, but I don't need you to like it. I'm hoping that my seminar will convince some people to at least give it a shot if they are feeling that they don't want to play it. And I think that there's plenty of misconceptions about Ikoria, and we're going to talk about them when we reach them. But okay, so why is Ikoria different? I think that it is the most unique set ever, at least from the ones that I played. So since Dominaria, realistically, because we don't count the prehistorical times when I was playing more actively. For first, it is a guild set, but I never heard it described as a guild set, because honestly, there's just 5 2-color archetypes that are sort of valid. The rest of them are maybe once in the blue moon they will come together. But you rarely will hear that Ikoria being described as a guild set, and there must be a reason for that. It's just that people don't perceive it as being a guild set. And I think that they are right, because there's so much to do within those 5-color, 2-color combinations, and occasionally the other 5s, that you don't feel that problem that the guild sets have, that it becomes samey after a very quick time. It's also a wedge set, and I did hear described it as a wedge set, so I can't say that I never heard it described like that, but I rarely hear it described as a wedge set. It's also because those wedges are not symmetrical, and this is the big issue. So yeah. Companions are designed into the set, and in their original form, so without the nerf, it added 6 to 8 extra archetypes. Right now, with the new rules, and unfortunately, I so much wish that they would apply the old companion rules to the draft in Ikoria, because who cares? No one really. And it would make the format even more playable, because by adding this free extra mana, some of the companions are probably not playable. It's a shame, because I love drafting Umori decks, but you cannot draft Umori decks if you need to pay 3 extra mana to get Umori to your hand and then cast it. Because the dream, of course, in the Umori decks was, on turn 2, I cast a Mana Dork, on turn 3, I cast Umori, and on turn 4, I just spawn out a bunch of creatures on board and gain advantage through that. It's not possible right now, which makes Umori more like a main deck card than something that I want to be companioning. It's a micro-synergy design, which means that there are additional archetypes that you can have inside of your actual deck by adding some small pockets of synergy. And we're going to be talking about some of them, but there are like those maybe 2-3 card combos that you can play. You can add a third color that does something that synergizes with your 2 that you're playing. You can approach certain cards as a sort of like mini build around, and there's plenty of those things going together. I'm going to touch on some of them and explain to you why I think how I think you should be playing them. On top of everything, there is the human, non-human, or teaming up humans and non-human cards that add the extra complexity into the deck building, because you have Mutate, that is a strictly non-human mechanic. You have some human synergies that work well, but you also have some cards that do something for human and a non-human at the same time, and not many of them, but knowing how to trigger those extra abilities is quite useful in the games. So this adds like extra complexity on deck building on top of that, because, for example, you can imagine playing some kind of a go wide human strategy, but on top of that, you will put some mutate things that enable going wide, because you cannot go wide with non-humans. It's not really supported. So you have to go wide with the humans, but you need to mutate using the non-humans. And it's a beautiful game of trying to make those decks work. Cycling 1 is a very unique thing for Ikoria, especially colorless cycling 1 never happened before or never happened after. And I have severe doubts if it's going to ever happen again. But this is also something that will help you in this synergistic format, because you can play smaller decks that are still coherent. Like the classic cycling deck was using 12, 13, 14 lands, which means that you could have lower spell density through that, because cycling occupied such a huge portion of your deck. But I think that the issue that many players had was that they only played cycling in dedicated cycling decks, and I don't think that this is the only place where you should be playing it. If you have a deck that is reliant on some kind of mini combos of different varieties, you can add those cycling 1 cards into your deck, and by doing so, you will draw into your combo much more frequently, because you will have a lot of cycling fluff in your deck. And of course, the only problem is that cycling 1 is cheap, but it's still not free. So you should be aiming at least for those cycled cards to do something in your deck if you possibly can. Also, there is not really an aggro archetype. Even those human decks that are supposedly aggressive are not like super fast in terms of the clock. And because of that, you have time to do stuff and you have time to get fixing. And actually, there is not such a terrible land fixing in this format as well. So you can do things that are slightly outside of the box. It was designed as a wedge set. And because of that, you have enough of the dual lands that you can potentially play 3 colors without too much problem, especially given low pressure on your life total. Because those aggressive decks are more grindy than super hyper aggressive. Okay, so first thing, I like to see Ikoria as the set of 3 macro-synergies. And there is the Mardu wedge, and it consists of humans, go wide, and some sacrifice themes. And that's one sort of macro-synergy group. There is Jeskai, which is cycling and spells, and those things overlap, combine, whatever. You can use them together. That's where you're going to have the highest density of your cycling as well. So that's, of course, where the natural home for the cycling deck was. And then you have Sultai, which is mutate, reanimate, kind of mid-rangey archetype group. But of course, there are very different builds of those Sultai and piles, depending on which kind of micro-synergies are you going to introduce to them. And this is the most wide view of the format. Then you have maybe a more refined view of the 5 color pairs that are actually supported. There's the Simic Mutate. There is the Golgari Graveyard Matters deck. Shockingly, Golgari Graveyard Matters. We never heard that one before, but it's fun in this format. So at least they have that. There is the Ores of Humans. There's the Boros Cycling, and there is It Spells. And all of those archetypes, in my experience, are valid and viable, and you can trophy with them no problem. You don't need to limit yourselves to the idea that Boros is cycling and the rest doesn't matter. Early when Ikoria was released, Boros cycling was a very abusable archetype, but I think that when it came back last time to Arena a couple of years ago, Boros cycling was pretty much not forcible. So people knew that the 1-mana cycling cards are good. They drafted them accordingly, and Boros was still strong, but it was not like super powerful. So I don't think you have to worry too much about the menacing Boros cycling. You will sometimes play against this deck, but in my experience, you can also easily win against them if you build your Mardu pile quite well, and if you yourself try to limit the availability of cycling cards, because they're also beneficial for you. So let's start with Mutate, because it was the main mechanic of the set, and it's present in every single color, and it's a very interesting mechanic, and it can be approached in multiple ways. The most canonical one is to play a Simic Mutate deck, maybe splashing black for some things, maybe splashing red for some things. So sort of like the space of Sultai and Timur can be Mutate decks if you get the right cards for them. And these are the 5 most important, I think, Mutate cards at lower rarities. 2 of them are top ends for Mutate decks, Archipelagor and Auspicious Starix. Both of them, if they hit the board, usually spells the end of the game very quickly. Archipelagor will probably get on board, tap 2 things for a couple of turns, and through that will create conditions where you can just win with this 7/7 Majestic Beast. Auspicious Starix, on the other hand, it's still big. It's a 6/6. 6/6 for 5, which is not terrible if you play it just as a vanilla creature. But if you mutate it, you will expand your board, because whenever this creature mutates, you exile the cards from top of your library until you exile X permanent cards, and you can put those permanent cards into the battlefield. So it very quickly goes out of control. If you mutate Starix on something that mutated before, then you just get 2 permanents on board. Okay, some of them will be lands, but like 50% of those will be creatures probably. If that happens again, you get 3, and it just like goes very quickly. If Starix stays on board for a couple of turns, you're winning this game, no problem. Then there's Migratory Great Horn. That's the common one. It costs 4 mana normally, but you can mutate it for 3. And if you mutate it, you can search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped. So the pattern with that is playing some 2-drop, mutating it on turn 3, and you have a big body, 3/4 for 3 is pretty decent, and you get a land on the battlefield tapped. So next turn you can mutate something for 5 mana. For 5 mana, mutating, you can, for example, get Trumpeting Gnar, and that's a 3 mana 3/3. But you can mutate it for 5, and whenever this creature mutates, you create a 3/3 green beast creature token. And the idea with the mutate is to try to pile up at least 3-4 creatures on top of each other and get many of those triggers. So if you start with the 2-drop, then put Migratory Great Horn on it, then have Trumpeting Gnar, and then put the Starix, then you get such a huge boost that normally opponents will not be able to deal with it unless they have like a really, really efficient removal suite, so they can stop you in your tracks. Apart from the mutators themselves, you need mutate enablers, and here are some good creatures that can enable mutation. Essence Symbiote is, I think, one of the best ones because it's a good creature on face value. It's a 2 mana 2/2, which is always fine. Whenever you mutate onto Essence Symbiote, you gain 2 life, which is important, so you get this nice cushion. Please don't tell me that the fly that I fought for 10 minutes with returned. It was hiding and it didn't run away. But okay, I'll live with that. And the creature gets a +1/+1 counter. So you play Essence Symbiote on turn 2, you mutate the Migratory Great Horn on top of that. You get 3/4 because you can choose which power toughness you get from the creatures you mutated, which one gives the toughness. And it becomes a 4/5. So you get like a turn 3/4/5 that will be, well, capable of attacking at the same time. So yeah, that's like a big curve out you can get in your mutate decks. Also, you ramp yourself so you can put big things in the future. Polywog Symbiont, another good card for that. It's a 1/3, so maybe less impressive than the Essence Symbiote on the face value, but each creature spell you cast costs 1 less to cast if it has mutate. So mutate also counts as casting it, so you get a cheaper stuff. And whenever you cast a creature spell, if it has mutate, draw a card, then discard a card. So you get like a lot of card selection. And Polywog Symbiont is fine. It's not like amazing, but it's fine. Then you have Zagoth Mamba. That's a 1/1 1/1. And whenever this creature mutates, target creature and opponent controls gets -2/-2 until end of turn. So it's like a neat combination of something that is a good recipient of mutate creatures. It will never give them power toughness because something else has to contribute, but it can kill things, especially against humans. It will kill quite a lot. And there are other creatures that I could pick, but I picked Farfinder because Farfinder is enabling you playing multiple colors. It's a 3 mana colorless creature, not an artifact, just a colorless creature. It's a 1/1 vigilance. And the 1/1 is, of course, completely unimportant for mutating, but vigilance is because the creatures that you mutate on top of it will get the vigilance from Farfinder. And when Farfinder enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and shuffle your library. So it gives you this nice guarantee that you will be able to start putting bigger things on top of the Farfinder because you got the land, and maybe it will fix your colors as well. So you can maybe turn 4, you can, I don't know, put something like Cloud Piercer on top of the Farfinder, and then you have a 5/4 vigilant creature. But this is just the sort of Sultai wedge of Mutate. There are decks, and I drafted those, that don't even need any green, blue, or black in them and be pretty valid Mutate decks. The one flavor I do like is white X go white decks that usually are there and are based on humans. But there are a couple of really good mutate creatures in white and in white-red that boost up your go white strategies. And two main ones, because they are uncommons, are Huntmaster Liger. That's a 4 mana 3/4, but it has mutate for 2 and a white. And whenever this creature mutates, other creatures you control get +X until end of turn, where X is the number of times this creature mutated. And perfect example of a play is you have a creature, you mutate the Huntmaster Liger on it, all your creature get +1/+1, and then next turn you mutate another Liger on top of that, and then they both trigger and they both give +2/+2 to everything, so everything you control gets +4/+4. And usually that ends the game because you have like a bunch of 1/1 creature tokens that become a 5/5 and swing. And this sounds like a fairy tale, but it actually is something that will regularly happen when you have them, because not many people are interested in drafting Huntmaster Liger, so you might actually get them quite late. And it's the same with Regal Leosaur. It's very similar to Liger, only it's a 2 mana 2/2, and you can mutate it. And whenever you do, other creature you control gets +2/+1 until end of turn whenever this creature mutates. And there's another card. It's a rare, but it's one of the best rares in the format. Cub Warden. It's a 4 mana 3/5 with Lifelink. And Lifelink is great if you're mutating stuff because, of course, it will always have this Lifelink. And whenever this creature mutates, you create 2 1/1 white cat creature tokens with Lifelink. So this is amazing value. So if you play something on turn 3, mutate this on turn 4, you get a 3/5 Lifelinker with basically haste, and then you make 2 1/1 cat tokens with Lifelink. You're going to be so much ahead in this game. And then imagine putting Huntmaster Liger on top of that in the next turn. When you kill a mutated creatures, both of them die, yes. If you kill the creature in response to mutating, the creature you're mutating on top will not die. The rest of the pile will die, but the one that you just cast will just enter the battlefield, but not as a mutated creature, just as a regular creature. When you mutate, does it trigger both abilities? Yes. So if I play Huntmaster Liger as a creature, and then I mutate another Huntmaster Liger on top of it, both abilities will trigger, because it says whenever this creature mutates, it doesn't care about which one was played when, both of them will trigger. So if I cast Cub Warden on turn 4 as a 3/5 lifelinker, and then put Regal Leosaur on top of it next turn, I'm going to get the 2 1/1 cats, and I'm going to get +2/+1 until end of turn for all my creatures. So that's why piling up those mutate things is such a high reward. But of course, it also is a high risk, because you can get, you're putting multiple cards on one card, and one removal is enough to deal with them. So yeah, Flepagoon. Cub Warden is extra juicy as it leaves non-human lifelinkers. The only issue is that it is too wide, so you can't really easily play it in those blue-green decks. It has been done though, so it is possible. You just have to play Cub Warden as your first creature on the pile. Then there is this sort of like Dimir controlling mutate package, and I think Pouncing Shore Shark is one of the best creatures in this category. It has a mutate for 3 and a blue and flash, which is nice because you can do it instant speed and do some shenanigans. And whenever this creature mutates, you may return target creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. So basically, it does the mana war. It's a 4/3 itself. So if you mutate it on something smaller, it is actually quite a sizable body. Yeah, and it's one of the best uncommons. I don't know. This year we're complaining about hats, but in Ikoria times, people were complaining that the shark has hands. Well, it's a mutated shark. That's why it has hands. Yeah, herbivore. There are definitely tricky decisions when it comes to mutate, and I'm going to give you one way of removing the trickiness out of them, although it comes with a huge deck building cost. So yeah. No, you can't cast the mutate mode at instant speed, except for the Pouncing Shore Shark, which has flash. But mutate is just like casting a creature at the normal speed. So yeah, Cavern Whisperer. That's another one. It has mutate for 3 and a black, and normally it just costs 4 and a black. It's a 4/4 menace creature, and whenever it mutates, each opponent discards a card. And this card looks benign, but actually, 5 mana 4/4 menace is a pretty good body. Giving menace to your mutate pile when you have put it on top of 6/6 Starix, it becomes a problem because they cannot really chump it. They need to try to trade them and stuff like that. And the discard, over time it does accrue, especially when you manage to trigger it like twice. And sometimes you just like, mutate it on top when they have last card in their hand. And yeah. Chittering Harvester is also one of those cards that work really good in the format. It's a 6 mana 4/6, but you don't want to play it for that. You want to mutate it for 5 mana, and whenever this creature mutates, each opponent sacrifices a creature. So it's basically edicts. And then you can imagine, putting it on something, making sure that they have an awkward decision to what to sacrifice, and then maybe doing it second time. All of those are great modes. And this is more like a grindy black-blue package that you can add on top of the Simic, or maybe you can play it separately in some kind of controlling deck. Then there's other mutators that were pretty good. And one of my favorite cards in the format is Lord Drakis. And that's a 1 blue-red for a lizard beast. It's a 2/3. Doesn't matter that much. It has a mutate for hybrid is it, so 2 mana. And whenever this creature mutates, return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. And this is amazing in some kind of spells deck, especially when you usually don't have that much to mutate, but putting a couple of Lord Drakis on something and getting spells back is just such a great value that you will quickly learn that Lord Drakis is something you really want to be playing in those decks. And there's Cloud Piercer, which I also really liked as a card because it's like a 5 mana 5/4 with reach, which is also nice because sometimes those kind of decks don't deal very well with flyers. Also, whenever it mutates, you may ramage. So you discard a card and then you draw a card. And the mutate cost is only 4. So you can play it on some kind of a 3-drop, and that 3-drop becomes all of a sudden a 5/4. It's not going to be secret anymore, that Jordan. It's going to be very, very well telegraphed. Maybe the win rate of the card will drop, but it can be used in many ways. I will show you one of them in a second. But in general, it's just like a big creature that gives you some card selection that can be used in some decks. And I do like it in spells deck as this sort of like a big finisher that also lets you ramage a land later in the game and dig to some gas while presenting a formidable threat. And there's Porky Parrot. That one is 4 mana 3/4, but you can mutate it for 3 mana. And it has tap. This creature deals X damage to any target, where X is the number of times this creature has mutated. And one dream, of course, is to put it on a pile of 5 creatures and then ping for 5. But simpler dream is to put it on a 2 mana death touch creature and have a death touching pinger and just basically ask opponent the question: do you have removal? If you don't, I just won. If you do, well, okay, I game continues. But I played games, and frequently the answer from my opponent was no, I don't have a removal, and then Porky Parrot with Boot Nipper managed to take over the game, because Boot Nipper is a creature that's a 2 mana 2/1. When it enters the battlefield, you can choose Lifelink or Death Touch, and it gets a token, a counter that gives them Death Touch or Lifelink. And yeah, there is the jellyfish that untaps itself, and then you can start machine gunning people. Herbivore, there are no protective tricks that are really good in this set. There is one that gives indestructible in white, but apart from that, oh yeah, there is the black also that can give indestructible. But there's not so much. There's none of the classic 1 mana green thing, give hexproof and indestructible or something like that. That doesn't exist. But yeah, there is 2 mana black spell that gives indestructible and 1 mana white spell that can give indestructible to human and non-human, and or both. Oh yeah, there's Keep Safe, but that's rarely played. But yeah, there is Keep Safe is a counter spell for spells that target permanent with cantrip. Okay, I think that covers the basics of the mutate. Let's move to the menace of the format, Zenith Flare. And cycling was the best archetype for the beginning of the format, at least. I think that later, as this format progressed, it was not even the best deck. But if something becomes the best archetype in the first week of the format, it will forever be associated with being the menace of the format. And in this particular case, it was worsened by the fact that Zenith Flare is a fundamentally broken card. And Ikoria is still my favorite format, but it would have been a better format if Zenith Flare was not printed, or if it was printed at rare. So Zenith Flare is maybe looking inconspicuous. It's a 4-mana instant. It deals X damage to any target, and you gain X life, where X is the number of cards with the cycling ability in your graveyard. By the way, also, it would have been actually manageable if it only could deal this damage to a creature or a planeswalker. But no, it had to go face as well. And the idea of Zenith Flare decks was to cycle, 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 cast Zenith Flare, game over. And this is not the greatest play pattern. And this was allowed because people were passing those 1-mana cycling cards quite late. And people playing Zenith Flare quickly realized that you actually don't care if you can cast your cycling spell if you're only planning to cast to cycle it. So they were picking black and blue 1-mana cycling things and just putting them in their Zenith Flare decks and just cycling, 11 cycling cards, playing 12 lands so that they don't flood, and finalizing it with Zenith Flare. Now, of course, this is not the only thing. Cycling is supported by other really, really powerful cards. So that Zenith Flare was so atrocious because if the Zenith Flare plan didn't work, they had plenty of other plans. And well, first things first, it's important that there are those 1-mana cyclers. And the 1-mana cycling is so much better than 2-mana cycling. It's more than 2 times better because you so frequently will have this 1-mana not spent during the turn cycle. You will not frequently have 2-mana unspent during your turn cycle. So you will sometimes cycle those things just incidentally when you have like a gap in your mana curve or something. Here are some examples of the 1-mana cyclers, but they are all really great. A card like Boon of the Wishgiver, if you're playing blue, is an amazing card because if you can cast it once in a while and draw 4 cards, yes, great. Memory Leak is sort of a coercion with cycling 1. And it, again, is a great card if you can cast it, but most of the time people put it in their decks where they couldn't even physically cast it. Footfall Crater is a nice card because you most of the, like 95% of the time you cycle it, but once in a blue moon you actually put it on your land and you make it into a fun way of ending the game. Yeah, I do like it. And there's a bunch of those 1-mana cycling cards. If you're playing cycling deck, you pick all of them really high because that's the only thing that you're really interested in, having the 1-mana cycling cards. Let's not go ahead ourselves to Jordan with the Wolverine. The Wolverine is coming. Then there's plenty of cycling 2 cards, and these were markedly worse than 1-mana cycling cards, and I usually played them with when I wanted to actually cast them sometimes. And my favorite example here is Lava Serpent. I played this card routinely in my blue-red spells decks. It was cycled maybe 60% of the time, but when I got to 6 mana, casting a 5/5 hasty beast was fun and usually was winning the games, so that was great. Neutralize, again, a card that most of the games you want to cycle, but if you see that your opponent is playing white-red, just keep it. Keep the mana up. That Zenith Flare is going to be there. They always have it. And if you can counter it, half of their planet goes to the garbage, and you might actually get a shot in winning this game. The Jordan, this is just gross. Let's not buy back the Serpent with the Moloch. Moloch is also a good card. It's like a 5-mana 4/4. And if I remember correctly, if you cycle the card on the turn you cast it, you can actually recast that cycled card next turn, which is fun. Easy Prey, another sort of like weird removal. Destroy target creature with converted mana cost 2 or less, but it has cycling. So sometimes it was actually a removal when something was annoying and cost 2 mana or less. And most of the time you could cycle it happily, and then you can just play the card. Oh yeah, okay, yeah, that was exactly. And then there is the different package of cycling, and those were the cycling creatures that when cycling, they were giving some kind of a bonus. And here I gave, I think, the 3 best examples of those cards in the format. Titanus Rex, it's a 9 mana 11/11 with trample, and it is cycling for 2, 1 and a green. And when you cycle it, you can put trample on target creature, trample counter, which well, permanently gives a trample. So first of all, it's like neat value. You cycle a card, you cycle a card, you fix your draw, you get rid of this 9 mana atrocity that stays in your graveyard for further use, and something else got trample. And similar card, Splendor Mare, it's a 3 mana 3/3 with lifelink, which is great just on its own, and that card was super playable. But it also has cycling, and whenever you cycle it, you can put lifelink on something. So sometimes you did it. I don't know, you have a porcupine and you cycle Splendor Mare, you make your porcupine into 4/3, and it gets lifelink permanently. So there is no way that you can be raced in this game. And Void Beckoner is a sort of like different version of Titanus Rex. Instead of being an 11/11 with trample, it becomes an 8/8 with Death Touch. And when you cycle it for 3 mana, you can put a Death Touch counter on target creature you control. So you can blow out opponent during combat by giving something Death Touch that they didn't expect could have Death Touch. Okay, so this is the main package of the Boros cycling deck. And we have some really, really strong cards here. And Flourishing Fox was not much weaker than Zenith Flare, honestly. If you played the Flourishing Fox on turn 1, that was sort of similar to putting the Porcupine and the Death Toucher together. You were asking your opponent, do you have a cheap removal spell? Because if you don't have a cheap removal spell, that Flourishing Fox next turn is going to be a 3/3. Next turn is going to be a 5/5/6/6. Because Flourishing Fox is a 1 mana 1/1. But whenever you cycle another card, you put a +1/+1 counter on it without any kind of limitation of how many times a turn this ability can trigger. So frequently cycling decks were turn 1 Fox, turn 2 cycle, attack for 3, turn 3 cycle, attack for 6. And then if you don't have removal, you have to deal with the 6/6. And then they can start deploying their other threats. Valiant Rescuer is a 2 mana 3/1 human. Whenever you cycle another card, for the first time each turn, you create a 1/1 human soldier creature token, and it itself has cycling. Also, Flourishing Fox itself has cycling, which is great. This whole category of cycling payoffs have cycling themselves, which makes them so much better, because if you already have one Flourishing Fox on the board, you might cycle the other one and get the counter rather than casting the second one. So yeah, Valiant Rescuer was allowing you to go very wide very quickly. You have a limit once per turn, but cycling is instant speed, so you could just cycle once on your turn, cycle once on their turn, and get 2 1/1s very quickly, while still drawing cards and hoping to get some things that are very useful for you. Then you have Dranith Healer and Dranith Stinger. Both of them are 2 mana 2/2s. One is white, one is red. Guess which one is white? Yes, it's the Healer. And they have sort of opposite abilities. Healer has whenever you cycle another card, you gain 1 life. And Stinger has whenever you cycle another card, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. And this was another kind of helper with the Zenith Flare kills. You cast Dranith Stinger, you cycle 5 cards during the game. You have some cycling spells in your graveyard, and then you cast the Zenith Flare, and hopefully that will be just enough. And again, both of those have cycling 1, so they are like super primed for this Boros deck because they are good in it and also are cycling 1 cards. And then there are cycling payoffs that don't have cycling themselves. My favorite of this list was Reptilian Reflection. It's a 3 mana enchantment. Whenever you cycle a card, you may have Reptilian Reflection become a 5/4 dinosaur creature with trample and haste in addition to other types until end of turn. And the play pattern with this was cast it on turn 4, cycle something, turn it into a 5/4. It has haste, and just slam for 5. Happy times. Another really good card in that was Prickly Marmoset. 3 mana 2/3 with first strike. And that first strike, it's like, why? Why do you put first strike on this? Why is it also first strike on all turns? This card was just like, if you're attacking, they have to block it, because if you don't block it, they might have 4 cycling spells and dome you for 10 all of a sudden. So you have to put something in front of it. And probably something with like 3 toughness, so they at least have to cycle once to kill it. And then on the blocks, it still can block your 8/8 if they really need to, and kill it without a trade. Just like, why? Why does it happen? So yeah, the card is pretty oppressive if you can get, those 11, 12, 13 1 mana cycling spells. And I really hope that people won't be able to draft those decks, but it might happen, at least in the first days. Snare Tactician, another banger. It's a 3 mana 2/3 human soldier. Whenever you cycle a card, tap target creature an opponent controls. So you build some kind of a board with your I don't know, Valiant Rescuer, with your Prickly Marmoset and whatnot. End of their turn, you cycle 3 cards, tap 3 blockers, untap, cycle some more, and swing. And hopefully that's enough. And then there's a card that looks probably slightly better than it actually played out. I'm not saying it's a bad card. I'm just saying it's not as good as the other ones. Savai Thundermane, red and white for a 3/2, so pretty good stats for an elemental cat. Whenever you cycle a card, you may pay 2. When you do, Savai Thundermane deals 2 damage to target creature, and you gain 2 life, so like mini Lightning Helix producer. The problem with this is, of course, you need to pay the extra mana, and it will be hard to kill like a 4 mana creature. You need 6 mana to do it, because you need to cycle 2 cards and activate the ability twice. Still, it's pretty decent. It's well statted, and it was pretty good. Just probably not as good as you might think when you never played Ikoria. It's worse than the Reflection. I think it's still worse than Prickly Marmoset, and it's not even close to Flourishing Fox or Valiant Rescuer in terms of power level. But again, cycling is associated with Boros, but it's not the only way of playing cycling decks. And my personal favorite was the blue-red cycling deck. And it was based, of course, on the 1 mana cycling spells. So one mana cycling things. Mainly spells, instants, and sorceries, because the cards that I want to be playing in this particular deck was the Spell Eater Wolverine. Spell Eater Wolverine is a 3 mana 3/2, my least favorite stat line, but it has double strike as long as there are 3 or more instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard. And the play pattern for this deck can be like this. Turn 1, you cycle something, a spell. There are plenty of those blue 1 mana cycling spells. Turn 2, you cycle something again, maybe even a 2 mana cycle, whatever. Turn 3, you cast Spell Eater Wolverine. And turn 4, you can put something like Cloud Piercer on top of it, Ramage another spell, draw a thing, activate the double strike, and swing with the 5/4 double striker. Of course, you don't have to do that. You can also do other things. You can cast things like Forbidden Friendship and Of One Mind. Forbidden Friendship, 2 mana spell that makes 2 tokens, one of them dinosaur, one of them human. There's a series of 3 cards in Ikoria that show this forbidden love between a man and a dinosaur, and it's beautiful. And I think Kibler was spoiling those cards, which was an extra level of cuteness to it. But Forbidden Friendship is the best of the 3. And making those 2 tokens, one of them being Hasty. If you played Lord of the Rings, you remember how good was the 2 mana make 2 Hasty 1/1s. This is close to that good. And more importantly, it creates a human and non-human. And blue has Of One Mind. It's a 3 mana, draw 2. But if you control a human and a non-human, you can pay only 1 mana for that. So it's basically Ancestral Recall that draws 2 cards instead of 3. Still good. And with this card and Forbidden Friendship, you always had those conditions fulfilled. You could draw quite a lot of cards and be very mana efficient, and just outgrind your opponent through the sheer card draw power in those decks. And I do like them. And also, of course, they all put spells in your graveyard that count for the Spell Eater Wolverine, which can later start doing damage. Yeah, this deck is more spells than cycling in lots of ways, but it can have other sort of cycling adjacent abilities. And I think that having those, specifically those cycling spells, allows you this particular deck to be denser than it is. So you can think that we're playing 40 card decks because we have to play 40 cards. But if you have like 5, 6 1-mana cycling spells, your deck becomes realistically more like a 37, 36 card deck. And that means that you will draw to your synergy pieces more frequently. No, Nerdy Steve, this definitely will not be about how Ikoria is objectively not a good draft format. This is your cross to bear. You can preach that idea there. Yeah, making 8/8 for 2 mana. So Ominous Sea is one of those cards that you can put in this deck because it combos well with the cycling, it combos well with Of One Mind, it combos well with the Cloud Piercer, it combos well with the Cathartic Reunion and stuff like that. So you can very quickly go to 8 counters and make the 8/8. Ominous Seas is an enchantment. Whenever you draw a card, you put a counter on it. When you have 8 counters on it, you can remove them and make an 8/8. It also has cycling on its own. So yeah, you can race to make those massive things. But I found that the Spell Eater Wolverine version was more predictable. Shark Typhoon, I think, is good in every deck, really. As I said, I'm not going to be using the data. And there is the black-green cycling, and it's a very different animal altogether. Black-green does things with graveyard, and there are at least 3 great... I know Herbivore, don't worry. I do know it's a joke. Those 3 particular cards are really good in this black-green decks, and the fact that they have cycling is very important for them. Greater Sandworm, 7 mana, 7/7, can't be blocked by small creatures. It has cycling too. Titanous Rex, I talked about, the 11/11 with the cycling. And Void Beckoner, 8 mana, 8/8 with Death Touch, with cycling 3, that also gives Death Touch to something else. And all 3 of those could be the sort of like a mini pocket of synergy within the set with those 2 cards, Unbreakable Bond and Back for More. Back for More, you should know because it's in OTJ. You know how good this card is. Now imagine how good it is when you're returning an 11/11 Trampler and fighting something big, eating something else in combat, and generally almost always 3/4-1ing through that. Returning Void Beckoner, almost as good, and sometimes maybe even better. Unbreakable Bond is also cute because it's a 5 mana reanimate spell, but the reanimated creature comes back with a lifelink counter. So if you return like Titanous Rex and just connect once, good times. So in your mutate piles, you could frequently, if you got like a late Back for More, if you got like a late Unbreakable Bond, if you pick this Titanous Rex at some stage, or even like hoping to pick up some Sandworms, you could put this like mini package of like synergy in this reanimator deck. And you didn't have to build your whole deck around it being a reanimator, because normally the problem with reanimator is that you need the reanimate spells, the things that put your stuff into graveyard, and the big things. But in this particular set, you have the big things that put themselves in the graveyard, which removes a lot of build around problems that reanimate decks often will have, that they become this A plus B plus C. These are just A plus B, and you are fine with lesser targets for the reanimation or something. So you're quite happy anytime you play it. And I had those decks with like 2 Unbreakable Bonds and Back for More and a couple of those Titanous Rexes, and it was just fine. And sometimes you won the game because you cast Titanous Rex, and sometimes you just reanimated a 4/4 and was also fine because it had lifelink. We can talk about Honey Mammoth. It was on the cover of the seminar, so that's fine. But we're going to talk about it later, because first we need to talk about Mardu strategies. And after the first weeks of trying to break mutates and like giving a try to the cycling strategies, I got bored with the cycling deck very quickly. I think that over 70 drafts in Ikoria that I played, I maybe played cycling twice, and yeah, I trophied twice. Yeah, hurrah! But I was more interested in how to make other things work. And quickly after this first couple of weeks, Mutate was very overdrafted in the start of the Ikoria and the original run. I don't think it's going to be the case now. It should be maybe a bit more accessible. But because there will be a mixture of people that know the format well and people that don't know, and the people that know the format well will maybe avoid the mutate slightly. After the first couple of weeks, I figured out that Whisper Squad is an amazing card. And at that stage, most people thought Whisper Squad is just trash, including me. My opponent played Whisper Squad on turn 1 against me, and I almost chuckled how stupid that person is. Well, a couple of turns later, when they had 4 squads on the board and maybe boosted them with an enchantment that gives humans +1/+1, it became less and less funny to me, and I'm like, I'm losing to this squad. Who's the buffoon now? And it happened second time against another opponent, and I'm like, you know what? That Whisper Squad is actually a good card, and it is a great card because you cast it on turn 1, and basically you deplete your deck from the squads and keep your hand completely full while expanding your board, which is great. And there's so many ways of using bodies in this format. We're going to talk about them in a second. And there's also many ways of getting those bodies on board. Night Squad Commando, especially when you're playing Whisper Squad, is a great card. You just can attack with the 1/1. People are worried about blocking it because who knows, maybe you have a trick or something, so they will let it in. You just play the Night Squad Commando and you get another white human soldier creature token. So you, for 3 mana, you get like sort of 3/4 of stats across 2 bodies, which is always a great stuff. Then there's General's Enforcer, and it looks solid because it's a 2 mana 2/3. It has the trinket ability of legendary humans you control have indestructible. Will very rarely come as an important thing. And for 4 mana, you can exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, create a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. This is also a way of getting rid of Zenith Flare. You just can exile their cycling cards from the graveyard and dedicate your life to trying to exile those. General Enforcer is actually probably the best uncommon in the set. At least it was according to the last run data. So don't underestimate that card. It's a really strong card. It looks more benign than it is. Making of those 1/1s is extremely important because your late game is all about generating small value. Yes, on one hand you spend 40 mana, but on the other hand, usually you have time for that because every time you exile something, they have to postpone casting their Zenith Flare for a turn or 2. And lastly, you have Day Squad Marshal. That's a 4 mana 3/3 that makes a 1/1. And this card, I really liked it in this format. I played like 3 copies of that in decks, and it was absolutely fine. Because those white and black decks, they have really good removal, so you don't have to worry about bigger creatures. Going wide with the board is how you win, and this did it very well. So these are like good generators of multiple bodies, and they're all humans, by the way. Then you have cards that help you to benefit from going so wide. And one of them, not the best one, but definitely a decent one, is Sanctuary Lockdown. Not every deck that you're going to be playing in this Mardu strategy pile is going to be a Sanctuary Lockdown deck, but some of them will be. It's a 3 mana enchantment. Humans you control get +1/+1, and you can pay 2 and tap 2 untapped humans you control, and you can tap target creature and opponent controls. There's too many instances of the word tap in this sentence, but generally, yeah, 2 mana, tap 2 creatures, tap a creature they control. So at the end of the turn, you just tap 4 of your creatures, tap 2 of their blockers, untap, swing. And your creatures are slightly bigger because every human gets +1/+1. So now all of a sudden all your squads are 2/2s, or your commandos are 3/4s and stuff like that. Then coordinated charge, and instantly there was a question: is it bad or am I spoiled by On the Job? Yes, you are spoiled by On the Job. On the Job is like unprecedented great for that type of spell. This much upside combined with potentially drawing a card is great. This card is good because it has cycling. So if you don't need charge in the particular game state, you just cycle it away and you look for something else. But in some games, you're just going to be cycling or digging towards that coordinated charge and eventually winning the game through that. Because it is a 5 mana instant. Creatures you control get +2/+1 until end of turn. But again, if you have things like the Valiant Rescuer, if you have any of those things, you will generate wide boards. The problem might be that you just don't have enough push-through damage. So you need the kind of spell like this that will make sure that you can win those wide board states and not be, not have to like swing with 4, 2 are blocked, 2 are dead. Now I just have 2 creatures, nothing happened really. So yeah, this helps with that. Then you have Bastion of Remembrance, and one of the most sneakily powerful cards. You may know it as the card from OTJ, Brackish Crew. It's not that great in OTJ, but in this particular format, this was amazing. Like, first of all, it's the same as Brackish Crew. 3 mana, make a 1/1. And whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. But it triggers on every creature you control. You are not exclusively limited to humans. And this card was the house, because you make so many of those 1/1s that at the certain stage of the game, you can just attack with 8 creatures and something will go in. What doesn't go in drains them for 1, which is most of the time enough for you to survive the crackback, for example. And opponents will start realizing at certain stage that, oh my god, I can't win against this card, because they will just put so many bodies on the board that I can't even attack, because at a certain stage the champ blocking is going to kill me. So yeah, great card, and especially in those black-white grindy decks. And those black-white grindy decks frequently would want to splash red for this card and this card only. And maybe sometimes, you play Forbidden Friendships if you're like more heavy on the Mardu. But Weaponize the Monsters was very often my one-off red card in the deck. It's a 1-mana enchantment in red. And it has 2 mana, sacrifice a creature, Weaponize the Monsters, deals 2 damage to any target. And yeah, this just doesn't look that great, but this card, sometimes you just cast it on turn 7 and you can see opponent being deflated because they know that there's no way in hell they're winning this game. And there's a couple of synergistic cards with that. We're going to talk about the Scorpion in a second. All those micro-humans will work with that. With Bastion of Remembrance, it's amazing. With steel cards, it's great. It does so much, and it will be ending the games so frequently. Like this card, at least last time it was on Arena, was going almost wheeling, and it should never wheel. This card is one of the most powerful uncommons in the set, and you should treat it like that. And if you don't believe me, just draft your white-black deck with all those creatures, or maybe red-black deck, and try imagining what would be your situation if you had weaponized the monsters on board. And almost every single time, you're going to come to the conclusion that my situation is going to be way, way better if I had weaponized the monsters on board. You don't want to overload in that because the second copy doesn't do anything, but you definitely want 1, maybe even 2 in your deck if you can generate a lot of those 1/1 tokens. And Mardu has access to some really strong removal. Dire Tactics is one of the strongest cards in the format. It's just white and the black for instant exile target creature. Okay, if you don't control a human, you lose life equal to that creature's toughness. But most of the time, you do control a human, so it's just a 2-mana exile target creature, which is insane rate for that at uncommons. And those cards can go later. If you see late Dire Tactics, it's time to go into the white-black lane in the draft. Heartless Act is a strong removal, but be careful because you can't kill things with counters on them. So that's the drawback. It still is pretty strong. Swallowhole is an interesting card. It's a 1-mana sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you tapped an untapped creature you control, and you exile target tapped creature. Remember, it has to be tapped to be exiled, but for 1 mana, that's not a terrible price. And you also put a +1/+1 counter on the creature that you tapped to pay the cost. So you end up with something bigger and killing something of theirs that was tapped. And there's mutual distraction. That card can sometimes be good if you have really like this go white strategy, because as an additional cost to cast this spell, you sacrifice a creature and then you destroy target creature for 1 black mana, which is really good bargain if you can spare the 1/1 body that you generate through, I don't know, Valiant Rescuer or something. So low cost for you. I'm not saying that you should play like a lot of those, but I think that in those go white decks, having a copy doesn't hurt, because that's just such a good rate for the removal spell. And of course, there are all the other removals that are in there, but I think that Swallow Whole, Mutual Distraction, and Dire Tactics are particularly good in those white-black decks. And then there's Bushmeat Poacher. And this is the card that makes those black-white decks tick. Because, yes, you generate those 1/1s, it's all fun and games, whatnot. Sometimes they will start playing like big creatures and overwhelming you. And this is where Bushmeat Poachers comes into play. Because Bushmeat Poacher makes each of your 1/1 stupid human tokens do this. I chump block, gain 6 life because I blocked the Honey Mammoth or something, sacrifice my 1/1, draw a card, gain 1 life. Instead of getting hit by 6, I'm actually gaining 1 life and drawing a card, drawing deeper into things that will be able to deal with that Honey Mammoth in the future. There are also whole combination of cards that work amazingly with Bushmeat Poacher. And one thing that this set has is potentially a 1 mana threaten effect. So Tentative Connection is just a 4 mana, gain control of target creature until end of turn, untap that creature, gains haste until end of turn. But this spell costs 3 less if you control a creature of menace. And I'm going to talk about it later in the slides, but there are really good ways of getting menace on your creatures. Yeah, thank you to Jordan for spoiling things. You're a blessing. You're credit to the force. But yeah, there's things like Blood Curdle. There's a bunch of other things that can give menace, which means that Tentative Connection will cost you 1 mana. So you can pay 1 mana to steal something, 1 mana to sacrifice it, and you still gain life and draw a card. It's just like insane rate for playing it. And when you have multiple Bushmeat Poachers, you can have multiple Tentative Connections. Another place where Mutual Distraction can be good if you have couple of those things. You can also sacrifice the thing that you stole in order to destroy something else, which is great. There is also, for very long games, the Durable Coilbuck combo, which Durable Coilbuck is a 2 mana 2/2, and for 5 mana you can return it from your graveyard to your hand. So 7 mana in total it costs to return it, play it, and 8 mana with Bushmeat Poacher to sacrifice it. But at some stage in those games, it did happen to me that I was just like, yep, slurp the Coilbuck to my hand, recast the Coilbuck, pass the turn. They attack, I block the coil with the Coilbuck, sacrifice, gain 2 life, draw a card. And of course, at certain stage, I'm going to draw into the responses. I can pause my Coilbuck loop for 1 turn and cast like 3 creatures, and then continue doing it later. So games in Ikoria can last long enough for that loop to be actually very significant for the game. And I also had games where I almost decked myself using the Coilbuck milling thing. And by saying almost, I mean, no, I totally looped myself sometimes. Okay, we can move to the companion. And before we start, I do know that this mechanic is hated. And I do understand why, because I can imagine how annoying it must be in Constructed. But in Limited, it is amazing. It adds to the draft. It's one of the few mechanics that impact how you draft, which is, I think it should be used more often, but maybe in some different version that doesn't break Constructed. But in Limited, Companion was great. When it returned in the Dominaria United, it was one of the features of that set was having companions and having this extra mini game of draft whenever you open one. And it plays great for the most of the time. And I wish we could play old companion rules in Ikoria Draft. Should be like in the rules of Magic that Ikoria Draft is with the old companion rule as it's stated on the companion advisory card that you open. Oh, is it yeah, it was March of the Machine, yeah. I think that companions are great. Yeah, they are more supported. Unfortunately, the new rule broke it because like Umori you cannot realistically play nowadays. But okay, let's start with the best one. Lurus of the Dream Den is just a great card. It's a 3 mana 3/2 lifelinker, which is already a good stat line. And each permanent card in your starting deck has converted mana cost 2 or less in order to companion it. And then during each of your turns, you may cast 1 permanent spell with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard. So yeah. this is a great ability. It doesn't look maybe that broken, but it's fundamentally broken. Casting Lurus on turn 5 and quickly recasting something from your graveyard. If Lurus survives, you accrue the value. You have things that you can multiple times sacrifice and basically get infinite value out of that. So one thing that you can do with Lurus is the Lurus cycling package. All the Flourishing Foxes, Valiant Rescuers, Dranith Healer, Dranith Stingers, they cost 2 mana. They cycle, they can get in the graveyard, you can cycle them, draw a card, recast them from your graveyard, happy times. That's one of the ways you can play Lurus happily. All those cards will be high picks when you have Lurus in your pile because you definitely will want to play them. And mind that Lurus says each permanent card in your starting deck has the converted mana cost 2 or less. So you can actually pick all the 1 mana cycling cards that are not permanents and still play them in your deck. We're getting there, Jordan. We're getting there. Benji is hyper today. He wants to be one slide ahead of me, and he manages actually. The most important card in Lurus piles is, in my opinion, Corpse Churn. That's a 2 mana instant. You put the top 3 cards of your library into your graveyard, and then you may return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Because if you companion Lurus, you will always have access to Lurus. Of course, it will be the primary target of any removal. And opponents will keep the removal to kill Lurus. And because of that, you need to cast Lurus probably more than once. Corpse Churn is a great way of doing that because not only you manage to get back your Lurus and recast it, but also you put some stuff in your graveyard, which means that you get a bigger selection of stuff that you can... it's from before when mill was a keyword. You get a bigger selection of stuff that you can put back from your graveyard to the battlefield using the Lurus ability. Then there's cards like Serrated Scorpion. It's a 1 mana creature, it's a 1/2, and when it dies, it deals 2 damage to each opponent, and you gain 2 life, which is a fun ability if you can put it as a chump blocker, because opponent will have really hard time to go through that thing, because you cast it every turn, and you drain them for 2 every turn, which means that at a certain stage, they just can't attack anymore, and you can rebuild your board. If you run out of steam, Sleeper Dart is a great card in Lurus deck. It's a 2 mana artifact, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. So just 2 mana cantrip. And you can sacrifice it. Target creature doesn't untap during its controller's next untap steps. So you can sacrifice it, and it doesn't tap that creature. But if something was tapped, you can just freeze it for you. Put a stun counter basically on it. The Sleeper Dart's biggest advantage is that you draw a card for 2 mana, and you can recur it with Lurus, which is great. And there are other things like Springjaw Trap that Benji mentioned, and all the 2 mana creatures you're super happy with. The important thing to keep in mind when you're playing Lurus is that spells can be more expensive. So, for example, you have the Call of the Death Dweller. There you go. A 3 mana sorcery. You can return up to 2 target creature cards with total converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Put a Death Touch counter on either of them. Then put a Menace counter on either of them. Call of the Death Dweller is great in those decks because most of your things will be 1-drops and 2-drops, and then for 3 mana you can get 2 things from your graveyard back to the battlefield with some upgrades. But also in emergency situation, you can actually just reanimate Lurus with it, so you get another shot at getting Lurus on board. Call of the Death Dweller is a great card for this particular deck. Unfortunately, biggest regret, you can't play Bushmeat Poacher in those decks because it costs 4. So sad times. All right. But Lurus is not the only companion. Lutri is very easy to companion. It's just that each non-land card in your starting deck has a different name, which is relatively easy to achieve. I think that the big problem with Lutri is that people try to companion it too hardcore, and sometimes will skip playing really solid cards in order to companion Lutri. I don't think it's worth it. It's worth cutting mediocre cards, but it's not worth cutting really premium ones. Like, I don't know, Fire Prophecy, the 2 mana deal 3, and you can change a card in your hand as you cast it. that thing, I probably would prefer to have 2 copies of that in Lutri in my main deck rather than Companion Lutri and skip playing one of those. Okay, Obosh, the Prey Piercer. 5 mana for 3/5. It has Companion rule. Your starting deck contains only cards with odd converted mana costs and land cards. If source you control with an odd converted mana cost would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage to that permanent or player instead. And there are some cards that I really like to play with Obosh, and one of them is Weaponize the Monsters. Yeah, the other one is the Spell Eater Wolverine. Thank you, Benji, for yet again being 5 seconds quicker than me. Weaponize the Monsters will deal 4 damage with this, and of course you're also prioritizing 1-drops because you only can play 1 free and 5-drops realistically in this deck. So you have probably a lot of fodder to sacrifice through Weaponize the Monsters. It deals 4 every time. When you cast Weaponize in Obosh decks and Obosh is on board, that's just like opponent is dead, almost assuredly. Then Serrated Scorpion, because of course it not only deals 2 damage on combat, but also it deals damage when it dies. It deals 2 damage to each opponent, which means it deals 4 damage to each opponent, and you gain 2 life. So Serrated Scorpions become a problem if Obosh is on board. Then you have the Spell Eater Wolverine. Obviously, double strike with doubling damage is good. So 1 hit from Spell Eater Wolverine will set you back 12 life if Obosh is on board. And then you have still plenty of those 1 mana cycling spells with odd casting costs. So you can actually fill up your graveyard for the Spell Eater Wolverine, and you can cast some spells that are odd value in order to give it the double strike. And Cloud Piercer is nice, not only because it's an odd casting cost creature, but also because its mutate cost is even. And that's something that you will see both in Obosh and Gyruda, Gyruda being the even version of Obosh, is that you want to put those cards that have the opposite mutate cost than your requirements for casting. Because the problem with those decks is, of course, that I cast 1-drop, on turn 2, I do something, I guess, I cast another 1-drop, on turn 3, I can cast a 3-drop, on turn 4, I can cast another 3-drop, maybe not optimal. And this is particularly the moment when you actually want to have this Mutate 4 thing. So you can cast the Mutate 4 thing on top of your 3-drop or on top of your 1-drop and fill in this gap in your mana curve that was created by you having to Companion Obosh. And also, of course, 5/4 that doubles its damage will end the game very rapidly. So that's fun. Okay, then we have Gyruda, Doom of Depths. That's a 6 mana Demon Kraken for Dimir Hybrid. It's a 6/6. It has a companion rule of your deck only contains cards with even converted mana costs. And then when Gyruda enters the battlefield, each player puts top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard. Put a creature card with an even converted mana cost from among those cards onto the battlefield under your control. So basically, mill 8 cards from both libraries. You can put one of the things with even converted mana cost from those cards onto the battlefield. So how I approach Gyruda is most of the time Sultai, because I think that the 2 most important cards for Gyruda are green. And these are Humble Naturalist, a 2 mana 1/3 that taps to add 1 mana of any color. Spend this only to cast creature spells. And Skull Prophet, which is a Golgari card. It's a 3/1, and it has tap to add black or green, or tap to put the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. And these cards are important because obviously your mana curve has holes. So you have 2s and you have 4s and you have 6s. And if you cast a 2 mana dork on turn 2, on turn 3 you have hopefully 4 mana. And if you have 4 mana, then you can cast your next progression on the mana curve. So you basically avoid the problem of not being able to cast 3-drops by casting 4-drops on turn 3. Also, it speeds up the casting of Gyruda, which I guess is your plan, so it's quite important. And another card that is doing this sort of similar thing as the Cloud Piercer was doing in the Obosh decks is the Migratory Greathorn, because it costs on paper 4 mana, you will rarely cast it as a 4-drop, but it has mutated 3. So if you have 2 drops, you can mutate the Migratory Greathorn on top of them, and you ramp yourself. So so you are also getting closer to casting that Gyruda. And this is the ramp package that I think is absolutely, or at least in my versions of the Gyruda builds, was absolutely essential. Then you have like cool Gyruda targets. And yeah, Chittering Harvester is something that you want to put in your deck. Honey Mammoth is absolutely premier in Gyruda decks because it's a 6 mana 6/6 that gains you 4 life. So like everything that you want to be doing, like getting Gyruda into Honey Mammoth is something that rarely ends well for the opponent. And there's another card, Lava Serpent. It is red, and I usually don't play that much red in those decks, but it does have cycling too. So I can cycle it early in the game, and if I mill it with Gyruda, I'm quite happy to get a 5/5 haste creature out of the deal. And this also is a potential home for one of my favorite non-official archetypes of Ikoria, which I called Reverse Mutate. And the problem with the Mutate is that when they kill your big pile of mutate creatures, you feel very sad. And we don't want you to be sad. What's the best way of not being sad? Well, having a big mutate creature that is basically untouchable. And Wingfold Terran is the card that enables it. It's a 6 mana 3/6, which is not great stats, arguably. But when it enters the battlefield, you have a choice of flying or hexproof counter that you can put on it. And obviously, in this particular version, it's hexproof. You put hexproof on it, and then you start mutating on top of it. And it can be part of the Gyruda package because it's a 6 mana creature, so you can actually mill into the Gyruda. Your deck is built to ramp. So you have those naturalists, you have those prophets, you have those great horns. So you want to get that 6 mana creature as early as physically possible onto the battlefield. And then from the moment when you put it on the battlefield, you can start piling on it. You can put the Chittering Harvester. You can put Starix. You can put Starix on top of that. Bunch of other things. And every single time you're going to get a trigger. I first did it in a Gyruda deck, but then I realized actually that's not a terrible strategy at all. And I started to try, at least if I got like a bunch of those 2 mana dorks, to get those Wingfold Terrans because they usually go quite late, to get those and to start to build those reverse mutate piles more frequently without the restriction of only having even creatures. So I could play things that like the Heron that draws me a card that costs 5 mana and was not available in the Gyruda builds. Like the Trumpeting Nars that, again, cost 3 mana, therefore cannot be in the Gyruda builds. And it sort of became a mini archetype of its own that I sometimes play when I want to have fun, when the whole mini game is to how early can I drop the Wingfold Terran onto the battlefield? How can I survive first turns just by basically ramping exclusively? And frequently you do, and it's fun. And then you end up with a big Voltron creature, and this is a perfect Timmy deck, but also requires some cunning deck building. So it's like a Johnny deck with Timmy game plan, maybe. And it's absolute fun to play. Okay, we have, I think, one last companion that I wanted to highlight a bit, and that's Karuga the Macro-Sage. It is hard as hell to build it, but it's very satisfying when you manage to do it. The problem with Karuga is that it's a 5 mana dice or a hippo 5/4, and your starting deck contains only cards with converted mana cost 3 or greater and land cards. And it's not easy, but I did have trophies with Karuga, and it's possible. You definitely need to make sure that you have some kind of life gain capabilities in those decks. And it was obviously much better in the old companion rules when you didn't have to pay the 3 mana tax. But I think that you can still get there with the Karuga, the Macro-Sage. You just need to really, really pray for being on the play every single game. That does help. And you need to really make sure that you have ways of coming back with life if opponent damages you too much. and you have to accept that some decks you're just going to lose. But luckily, the aggro decks are not that fast, so you can actually win. The biggest problem with those decks is that there is a lot of good removal that costs less than 3 mana, and you have to skip those cards, unfortunately. So make sure that you get the really good removals that cost 3 and 4 mana because you do need them. How frequently should you play a companion in the main deck? You should be realistic that it's a beautiful dream to chase, but you won't always get there. If you don't get there with Karuga is a great main deck card because you sort of half built your deck to accommodate Karuga. You put a couple of cheaper things that will actually increase your chances of surviving the long game, and you can happily play it. Yeah, Umori is a great main deck card. Umori, unfortunately, was completely killed by the nerf, because before the new companion rule that you have to pay 3 mana to get the card in your hand was introduced, you could just cast Umori whenever you wanted to. So the pattern there was exactly the same as with Garuda. You just played the Humble Naturalist on turn 2, you played Umori on turn 3, and on turn 4 you just spilled out a bunch of creatures and you happy times. The cost of not putting anything but creature in your deck is quite high. So so you needed to have that extra boost of the burst of activity on turn 4 with 5 mana. But unfortunately, if you have to pay 3 mana to get Umori back to your hand, then you cast it on turn 4, it's not as good as it used to be. And that sort of disqualifies it from being a companion, unfortunately. Okay. Well, and I think that, you can build Zerda decks, and I've seen some absolutely wild Zerda decks that are based on the Brushwalk card. It's a 1 mana, 1/1 trampler, but for 3 and a green, you can give it +3/+3 and trample and +3/+3 until end of turn. Zerda is a companion that reduces the cost of abilities by 2, so you could pump your Brushwalk for 2 mana, and you have multiple Brushwalks and Zerdas and Zerda, and then you can basically spend 6 mana to make it a 10/10 and swing, which is fun. And there's interesting part. Cycling is an ability, so cycling costs you less when you have Zerda, for example. So all your 2 mana cyclers become 1 mana cyclers. And you can build around it, but it will come together very, very rarely. Yorion is a card that I would like to warn you against. I don't like to companion Yorion. I like to play it in main deck because it's, of course, a great card. But companioning it, I think, is more often the mistake than it's not. And then you have Karuga, which is so hard to companion and limited that it basically never happens. Did I miss one? Oh yeah, Giganta. Giganta is actually easy to build. Giganta has a companion rule. No card in your starting deck has more than one of the same mana symbols in its mana cost. It's relatively easy to companion. It's a good card. If you see a couple of really strong double-pipped cards that you want to be playing, just don't companion it, put it in the main deck. It's also fine. So yeah, but most of the time you will be able to play Giganta in your main deck. Okay, and the last thing I wanted to talk about is the tribal decks. So I told you that it's a guild set, Ikoria, and the enemy color pairs are the ones that are mostly represented. However, there is a very minor sub-theme of tribal abilities in the allied color pairs. And here I gave you 3 examples. I think the best cards in this cycle: Labyrinth Raptor, black-red for a 2/2 menace. Whenever a creature you control with menace becomes blocked, defending player sacrifices a creature blocking it. So it's like a 2/2 with menace that is really, really hard to block, because they will definitely lose one of the creatures and probably 2. Also has a black-red ability: creatures you control with menace get +1/+0 until end of turn. And there is a bit of this menace kind of synergies that sometimes you will not draft a menace deck, but sometimes you will get this late Labyrinth Raptor and you get a couple of other menace things, and you can put a mini package in your grindy Rakdos or Mardu deck that contains this kind of menace synergies. Then there is green-white, which is a vigilance tribal, and the rare card in there is a 4 mana 3/5 with vigilance, Frontland Felidar, and it has creatures you control with vigilance have 1 tap target creature. So the idea is that I swing with my vigilant creature, and before declaring blockers, I can tap out some of the defending players' creatures. And I can do it with some, not do it with some, but yeah, it's like a neat ability. Then there is Quartzwood Crusher. That's 2 red, green for a 6/6 trampler. And whenever one or more creatures you control with trample deal combat damage to a player, create an XX green dinosaur beast creature token with trample, where X is the amount of damage those creatures dealt to that player. And this card, if it's not responded, it just ends the game there and then. It's very hard to cast because you really need to be in a red deck that splashes a bit of green, because red-green is not really a playable archetype. But if you can play it, it's going to be great. I mean, 5 mana 6/6 trampler that makes more tramplers, and every trampler, when it connects, makes tramplers. This is like exhibit style. I heard you like tramplers. I have more tramplers, whatnot. Great card. It's not really a build around because this card does everything on its own, but it's very powerful. But apart from those rare cycles, there are uncommons, and some of them are actually good. And obviously, Benji in the chat said that the Vigilant Heat Bonders, they are called, that the Vigilance Bonder is actually a great card. It's a 1 hybrid Selesnya creature, Vigilance 2/4, and at the beginning of your end step, you gain 1 life for each creature you control with Vigilance. And even if it's just the Heat Bonder, that card is decent because it's a 3 mana 2/4 Vigilant creature that gains you 1 life every turn. If you have 2, it becomes silly because you gain 2 life every turn. And it's relatively easy to actually get like 4 Vigilant creatures on the battlefield. There are ways of doing it if you really want to explore the synergy, because I don't know, you have Frontland Felidar. There are some cards that will help you with your Vigilance abilities, and I'm going to show you in a second. Then there's like other bonders. I think that the Gruul one is sometimes playable. That's 4 mana, so 2 and hybrid Gruul, 4/3 trampler. And creatures you control with trample you may have this creature assign its combat damage as though it weren't blocked. So some decks will just have a couple of tramplers, and opponent will be at low life, and Wild Bonder will just make sure that you can go for lethal. It will sometimes happen. Also, it's a big human, which I sometimes played it in my Wynota decks. When I had Wynota, I also put Proud Wild Bonder because that's the great way of putting a larger human onto the battlefield using Wynota triggers, which was fun. And then you have Sonorous Howlbounder. That's 1 Rakdos hybrid, 2/2 menace. Each creature you control with menace can't be blocked except by 3 or more creatures. So basically, gives all the menace creatures unblockable for the purposes of that. And this card, it's not great often, but when it's great, it's great. When you have like a bunch of menace creatures on board, opponent will never be able to block. And that's pretty neat. It's it's still like a 2/2 menace for 3, which is not a great rate, but in some decks it's good to have one because there is ways of getting menace, and there are some decent menace creatures in the set. And finally, for tribal, there are mentors. There's 5 of them at uncommon in each color. They're monocolor cards, and each of them has, whenever this mentor enters battlefield, insert a name here, counter on target non-human, it's always non-human, creature you control. And they all have an ability of pay some mana, tap it, and put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with the ability that it gives. So Kingside Mentor is 2 and a white for a 1/4. It puts a vigilance counter on something, and then you can tap it for white and 1 and a white to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with vigilance. And this one I actually played like hardcore build around when I had like, I don't know, 9 creatures with vigilance in my deck, plus Keensight Mentor, and I was pumping them all and making ridiculous things. The Duskfang Mentor does the same, but with lifelink. And this one is more like a self-contained card. Just cast it and you give something lifelink, make it grow. Maybe you have a couple of other lifelink things that can also grow, but you don't care that much about it. And Frill Scare Mentor is 3 mana 3/2. that gives something menace when it ETBs, and then it can put counters on each creature you control with menace, and this can actually work with some of those menace enablers, like the Howlbonder and Labyrinth Raptor makes them better. It's not the greatest of strategies, but sometimes you will find decks when those cards are actually good. And the trick of playing Ikoria is to recognizing when should I go for those mini pockets of synergies. And as I said, Vigilance, I think, is the most supported of the ones. There's a bunch of like okay Vigilance creatures. It's nothing to write home about, but if you can squeeze out some synergies out of them, that's great. So we got like Moscow Goriak, which is like a 3-mana 2/4 Vigilance. And it's not terrible. It's a good stat line for that. It will stop you from losing the game early, stall the board. And if you have the Heat Bonders, if you have the Frontland Felidar, they become, of course, much better. They're also like pretty decent target for mutating because they give Vigilance. So you can have some mutate/Vigilance packages in decks. Then you have Solid Footing, which is a card I like in very select groups of decks, but it's a 1-mana aura, white for flash aura. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1. So it can be used as a sort of like 1-mana combat trick that gives +1/+1 until end of turn and beyond that. But it also has, as long as enchanted creature has Vigilance, it assigns combat damage equal to its toughness rather than power. And that can be great because you can play like turn 2 main Serval, which is a 2-mana 1/4 Vigilance. Then you cast Solid Footing on it and you swing with it like it's a 5/5 on turn 3, which is not bad at all. And if you can do it repeatedly, that's actually like a nice base for some kind of an ultra aggressive deck, but that requires this A+B combo to be successful. And I did draft some of the main Serval. I had 4 Solid Footings and 4 main Servals in my deck, and that was the plan of the game. And they actually on occasions worked. And in the worst case scenario, Solid Footing became this combat trick on a non-vigilant creature. Also, this is the card that could have used maybe cycling. Maybe not 1, but cycling 2 on Solid Footing would not have been a bad thing for the format in general, I think. And as I said, you have the menace synergies. Tentative Connection is one of them. It costs so much less when you have a creature with menace that it's worth to play creatures with menace just to be able to enable that. Again, card that also wants to have Bushmeat Poachers in the same deck in order to have a fun, I steal your thing, sacrifice it, gain a bunch of life, and draw a card. Blood Curdle is probably the best common in the set. That's 3 and a black for an instant, destroy target creature, put a menace counter on a creature you control, so you get like an extra enabler to give something menace. And actually, Cavern Whisperer is a way of giving other creatures menace by mutating on top of them, and they automatically get menace. So yeah, that is a neat ability. Last thing is there's very few trample synergies outside of this, outside of the Quartzwood Crusher, but there are some, and some of them occasionally can become important. Ram Through is a 2 and a green instant. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. If the creature you control has trample, excess damage is dealt to that creature's controller instead. And yeah, I mean, usually it's just a solid bite spell, which is fine. But sometimes when you have a Titanous Rex, it can become your plan to win the game because you can reanimate the Titanous Rex and then ram through a creature and ram through a 3/3, and you deal 8 damage to the face, which is useful. Then there's like Fully Grown. Target creature gets +3/+3 and until end of turn, and you put a trample counter on it. +3/+3 and trample as a combat trick is great because if you have big creatures like Honey Mammoth, for example, this is going to be the way that you're going to be able to break through those 1/1s that the Bushmeat Poachers is chucking in your face. It's a one-off card. Sometimes you will have like some additional synergies, but whatever. And Footfall Crater, it's the enchant land that has cycling 1 that you're going to play in your deck. And this is just a reminder that apart from being just a land with cycling aura with the cycling 1, it has an ability The land that you enchanted with it has an ability of tapping to give target creature trample and haste until end of turn. And don't forget that you can cast Footfall Crater, because I've seen many times when my opponents were cycling the Footfall Crater when actually casting it would have won them the game against me, but they just forgot that this is actually a card, not just a cycling vessel. So yeah, there you go. What can I say? I do love my Ikoria, and there's so much more than I could have conferred in this very brief primer. I think that the best way of experiencing this format is to play it, and the best way of getting some appreciation is to tag me if you trophy in Ikoria, and let me know what you did and what kind of neat combos you found in your decks, because there's plenty of those little combos hidden across the cards in Ikoria. Also, I like it because honestly, I'm shaved right now, but if I grow a mustache, I very much look like Cheville. All my people in the LGS were always mocking me, and I didn't care. Why would I be angry if someone calls me awesome? And with that bombshell, I think I'm going to end the episode today. Let me know if you had fun in the Korea, and well, if you want to listen to me this week, well, later this week I might be on limited resources, and by might, I will. So I'll hear you there. Of course, thanks to the 17 Lens team. They didn't do much this time, but hopefully I will have some Ikoria data to analyze after the week is gone. And thanks to Fake Jake Brown, as he is in the chat right now, I might as well acknowledge his existence. Thank you, Jake, for releasing this in the podcast format tomorrow early in the morning before Ikoria hits the arena. Thanks for that. You're amazing. And thanks to my patrons, and thanks to mtgazone.com. Hopefully, when I release it tomorrow, I will put the link to the article, because that should be coming in. Yeah,